You're a writer of political economy, you're a staff writer at Tribune, and obviously the author of this book, Vulture Capitalism, available at all good bookstores. I'm going to start actually not with the book. I'm going to start with some of the coverage of you over the past few months, and The Guardian described you as the TikTok's answer to Tony Benn, which is quite a funny title. And I do wonder, you know, the Times, I think the Times said in an interview with you, they sort of suggested that you were algorithm hacking in order to sort of get the sort of message of your book out there. But clearly, there's a real appetite for some of the things that you're saying, and perhaps an appetite among young people in terms of some of the things that you're saying. So what do you think it is about the way society is set up these days which make a book like this sort of appealing and intriguing to people?
A great question, and a great setup to the question as well. That kind of TikTok of Tony Benn thing I found really funny, because it was part of the interview where I said something like, look, you know, I'm not trying to be some kind of 1970s socialist, and then literally went on to quote Tony Benn like moments later, which is something I'm often guilty of because I do love to quote Tony Benn. But what I find funny about this whole like image of me that I think has come out, particularly over the course of me promoting this book, is the idea that I'm really kind of savvy with social media, and I'm kind of using clever algorithm hacking to implant Marxism in the like minds of impressionable young people, was that I was never very good at it. Like, I was always very focused on basically very boring, abstract ideas about Marxism, like reading texts that most people would find probably very dull and irrelevant. And then I have to be constantly reminded by my publishers, by my publicists, by everyone working with me, that's great, but can you say it in a way that everyone can understand and is actually relevant to most people's lives? And I've kind of been on a bit of a journey, really, over the course of writing 3 books, to do what my publicist on this book said. He said, Grace, you have to earn abstraction. If you want to talk to people about abstract ideas, you have to start by grounding it in something that they can really understand. And that is basically what I tried to do with this book. You know, this book came out of a set of ideas I had about the way in which people understand capitalism and socialism. So, you know, some of the events that really brought me around to thinking about this was after the 2019 election loss. And I had been quite involved in the Labour Party over the course of that campaign, but had been door knocking, you know, going all around the country being like, this manifesto is going to make your life better, which is obviously very convincing when it's me showing up on someone's doorstep in kind of Sunderland telling them that. So that kind of catalyzed a bit of thinking, okay, what do these ideas mean? How can they, you know, connect with people? And then going straight into the pandemic and being brought on TV with people like Piers Morgan and being asked questions like, well, Jeremy Corbyn lost the 2019 general election, but now the government's doing loads of stuff. So it's basically like we've got socialism anyway. And there was this whole narrative around the pandemic that the government doing stuff was socialism. And again, bringing back to the kind of very boring Marxist texts, it got me thinking about people like Ralph Miliband, for example, who is the father of Ed and David Miliband, a Marxist theorist of the state who was writing in the 1960s. People like Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian Marxist theorist writing in the 20s and 30s. And their argument was that politics and economics, the state and the market, are not separate. That in a capitalist society, the state is essentially a social relationship. Now, Marxists think about capital as a social relationship. They think of, you know, the way that things are produced in terms of the social relationships that underpin that. And particularly the relationship between people who own the things we need to produce things and those who have to work for a living. In the same way, the state is a social relationship. It is based on the balance of power within society. So the outcomes you get within political institutions reflect the balance of power within society as a whole, reflect which groups are able to organize most effectively to make their ideas, to turn their ideas into policy, to lobby politicians, etc. And so I, you know, basically was like, well, this argument needs to be remade in a way that people can understand, so that people aren't looking at left politics and basically saying, oh, those guys just think the state wants to do everything and a bigger state will make everyone's lives better, which is, I think, something that was potentially a danger in the campaigning that I've been doing before. and really bring home this message that all of those theorists had at the core of their writing, albeit in kind of highly impenetrable ways, which is that basically socialism is equivalent to true democracy. Because the argument that I make in this book is that a society like ours is based on extreme concentrations of power at the very top of the economy. And those extreme concentrations of power at the top of the economy bleed into the way we organize politics, such that we end up with a society that looks more like a form of oligarchy, in which the power of, you know, the largest financial institutions, big corporations, most powerful states consistently reproduces itself. Even as we're told we live in a free market system in which competition means that the most effective rise to the top and those who misuse their power will lose elections or be outcompeted by other companies. Instead, you have this kind of rigid system of inequality that seems to change very little, even as, you know, many other areas of society change. So my argument is that in this book is basically, if we don't have this rigid separation between states and markets, and you can't say socialism is when the government does things and capitalism is when the market does things, because these two sets of power relations are so linked with one another, then you have to rethink what is meant by socialism. And for me, that means, right, we have this system of capitalist oligarchy, of capitalist kind of central planning almost. And in that sense, socialism is really about pulling power down from the top and giving ordinary people control over how they organize their lives. Now, I realize that has been a lot of abstraction. So the next question you ask me, I will illustrate those points with examples.
No, I mean, we'll get to examples. I mean, why do you think, because one of the things you say in the book is, you know, which I think kind of summarizes what you said just there, which is that, you know, life under capitalism means living in a planned economy, so living in an economy where corporations and states and financial institutions are doing a lot of planning for you, while being told that you are free and thinking that you live under a free market economy. And so why do you think there has been, or why do you think there still is a sort of misunderstanding about capitalism in our society? Is it that we are being misled by governments who are telling us that we live in a free market when you know, at least by your argument, we don't? Or is there a sort of failure of communication from socialists to sort of really explain to people what's going on here?
I think in some ways it's become a kind of habit of thought. It's just become, it's almost like a meme. It's a way that people process information about the world, which is this idea that you have states on the one hand and markets on the other hand, and that capitalism is associated with markets and socialism is associated with the state. Now you can trace this back very obviously to the divide between the US and the USSR, where there was this, you know, very clear dividing line. You have a free market capitalist society on the one hand and then a centrally planned socialist society on the other hand. But it was also very, very central to the neoliberal revolution of the 1980s. So this was the kind of transformation of economic thinking driven by a number of prominent academics and policymakers, culminating in the election of leaders like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Pinochet in Chile. And their thesis was basically that during the post-war period, when we had this kind of social democratic model, the state had become too big. And that was in the words of Hayek, who was one of the kind of foremost among these thinkers, leading us down the road to serfdom. So he took this divide between the US and the USSR and said this is a divide that is all about the role of the state in society. So when you have a state that becomes too big and that kind of overwhelms the market, it inevitably leads to authoritarianism and oppression. And this argument, you know, was, I suppose in some ways was rooted in the common sense of the time, but it was also rooted in a lot of people's experience of what the social democratic model looked like. Because this was a form of leftism that had kind of, it really dominated. It was the most successful that the left had ever been, certainly in the Western world. It, you know, gave us social democracy, it gave us the NHS, it gave us kind of, you know, big nationalized corporations and all those sorts of things. But there were thinkers at the time, like, for example, Tony Benn, who said that this socialism that we have built for ourselves now, this social democracy, it cannot be lasting because it has not resulted in a in a transformation of people's daily lives to a significant enough extent, because it hasn't resulted in an expansion of human freedom, because it hasn't resulted in a kind of deepening of democracy and a feeling that people would have of kind of power over their lives. Instead, it has resulted in this kind of larger state that is doing a lot of things for a lot of people and making people's lives better. But that power hasn't really trickled down, I suppose, to most people. So this neoliberal critique, which was like, the state has gotten too big, we need more market, it really embedded itself until it became common sense, because they did what you should do with a good political message if you want it to stick, which is repeat it over and over and over again until you are so bored of hearing it. This is, by the way, the exact advice that Cameron and Osborne had about fixing the roof while the sun is shining and we're all going to have to make sacrifices. You repeat that over and over again, there's no money left, until it just becomes common sense and people realize it, despite the fact that it is categorically not true. It becomes a way that you organize your thinking about the world. And this is what happened with the kind of state-market divide. The issue is that it's not true. The transformation that we saw in the 1980s under neoliberalism didn't result in a shrinking of the state to create more space for the market. It simply resulted in a shift of power within society and therefore a change in the nature of what the state was doing. So states didn't really become smaller under neoliberalism. Under certain measures, state spending fell, but state power expanded in a lot of areas. You saw that in the 1980s with the kind of brutal repression of strikers, for example, but all the way through to the financial crisis and, you know, all the regulation that had been put in place to manage the finance sector up to that point. You saw it during COVID. Big states making significant interventions in the economy, but those interventions were geared not towards making ordinary people's lives better, but to shoring up the power of elites and you know, generally the power of large financial organizations, and during the pandemic, big corporations, which got an extraordinary amount of support from governments. So this narrative, which was, we're going to make you all feel free by shrinking the state and expanding the role of the market in your life, is not what happened, but it was an extremely powerful ideological move that allowed people, or kind of made people equate the reduction in spending on, you know, the NHS, public services, benefits, etc., and the rise of corporate power with freedom. And in fact, it's given us the opposite of freedom, because most people, if you ask them, particularly people in positions of disadvantage, how much power do you feel like you have in your own life? How much agency do you have over the things that are happening to you in your workplace, in your community, over the big events that are taking place in this country? They will say very little, because basically their lives are controlled by big corporations at work, big financial institutions when it comes to lending and borrowing, and governments that have very little accountability when it comes to everything else.
And you know, the book sort of lays out your theory, but then is really quite dense with examples. And one of the examples you use is Boeing, which I think is a great example in synthesizing everything you've been saying about public-private, the public-private spheres of power in terms of the free market and control. So why don't you just sort of briefly talk about how Boeing fits into this system which you've described?
I'm glad you asked that, because this is the point at which I earn my abstraction, although I'm pretty sure I'm supposed to be doing it the other way around, but whatever. You guys seem to be engaged enough. So the Boeing example is really fascinating, and I like to contrast it with another example, again from the 1970s, about kind of democratic production in another aerospace company called Lucas Aerospace in the UK. But the Boeing example is fascinating. Many of you will have seen that Boeing has been in the news recently. There have been doors that have blown out of Boeing planes mid-flight. There currently at the moment in the US, there's a big strike going on. There have been whistleblowers coming forward and saying Boeing is manufacturing planes in a way that is unsafe. That is something that has been going on for quite some time now. But if you think back to 2018 and 2019, there were two significant plane crashes in which nearly 350 people died, both involving Boeing 737 MAX planes. Now, what had happened is that Boeing had created a plane that was dynamically unstable, basically, and they'd done this to make the plane bigger, to allow it to fit on more passengers, to make it more attractive to their customers. And they had created a solution to this problem, which was a software solution that caused the plane's nose to tilt down automatically whenever, this problem started to arise. And the pilots weren't told about this, piece of software. They weren't trained on it, because if they'd had to be trained on it, then that would have cost the airline companies a lot of money. And Boeing agreed with the airline companies, you will be able to take this plane and you will not have to retrain your pilots. So what happened in both these cases is this system was activated, the plane's nose started to tilt down, and it was basically, the engines were on and it was diving straight into the ground. So you had two massive plane crashes, astonishing levels of force that took place in both. Initially, Boeing tried to blame the pilots for what happened. But as it turns out, they had been kind of fighting against this system for the entire plane journey. And then it transpired that this software fix had been put in place to get around this significant problem with the plane's design. And it had all been about this transformation in Boeing's philosophy, where prior to kind of the 1980s, it had been known for its pilot-first philosophy. So as a pilot with a Boeing plane, you felt that you were in control. During the 1980s, the American state engineered a merger between Boeing and a firm called McDonnell Douglas. McDonnell Douglas was very important to the US because it supplied the Department of Defense and Pentagon and the US military. So the state engineered this merger, said, Boeing, you're going to take McDonnell Douglas. And the culture of this firm became embedded in Boeing. And this was also the time of kind of shareholder value revolution. So Wall Street expecting you to deliver big profits. And Boeing really took this message to heart. It got a new CEO that basically said, screw the workers, screw the engineers. I'm going to put in layers and layers of middle management. Their role is to cut costs and make this company work as efficiently as possible, i.e. you're producing as much value as you can for the lowest possible price. They went to war with their unions, and they became a kind of darling of Wall Street in the process. They delivered astonishing profits until they delivered two planes that nosedived out of the sky and were found to have deliberately conspired to deceive the United States government. So when you hear that story, you think a classic case of corporate greed, of kind of people at the top exploiting workers and abusing their power. But what's fascinating about this story is the extent to which it was kind of a joint project between Boeing and the United States government. Because in 2018 and 2019, the years of these crashes, Boeing was the largest recipient of corporate welfare in the US. That's tax breaks, subsidies. The government was funneling money into this corporation to keep it alive. It was being regulated by the FAA, and the FAA had, thanks to successive rounds of regulation by Congress, moved to a philosophy of self-regulation. This was the same sort of regulatory philosophy that underpinned how the banks were regulated before the financial crisis. And the idea is basically no plane manufacturer is going to create an unsafe plane. It would damage its reputation, so we don't really need to regulate it. So at the time of the disasters, Boeing was being regulated by a unit of the FAA that sat in Boeing and whose workers were paid by Boeing. Massive conflict of interest, obviously. The other problem with this argument that they wouldn't manufacture a plane that was unsafe is that the market itself was highly uncompetitive. There are basically two firms that manufacture planes, Boeing and Airbus. And they're both very imbricated with their respective governments or international institutions. So the EU and Airbus have a close relationship. Airbus has been involved in corruption scandals. Boeing and the US government have an immensely close relationship. And all of this was very, very clear in the run-up to those crashes. But it was also clear after the crashes, because when the pandemic came about and Boeing was struck with declining orders because of the disaster that took place in the airline industry over that period, it got a massive backdoor bailout, despite having been found to have deceived the United States government by putting planes that were known to be unsafe onto the market. And ever since then, the United States government has basically continued to support this company. It has faced very little pushback for manufacturing these planes that have been found to have multiple very serious flaws. It hasn't been regulated properly. And basically, there's been no accountability. The whole idea of having a free market system is there are supposed to be immense amounts of accountability. Because if you do anything wrong, the competition will come in and undercut you, and then you'll be dead. And, in a kind of regulated social democratic society, where that role is not played by the market, for example, in areas where there's less competition, the government is supposed to be able to regulate these companies in the public interest. And instead, what we have are basically large, powerful corporations working together with financial institutions, with very powerful governments to protect their own interests and their wealth and power at the expense of the public interest. That is not a free market democratic system. That is an oligarchic, centralized system based on effectively what in any other nation we would call corruption.
And it sounds as if it sounds as if smaller companies, in a way, are also victims of this, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a kind of interesting analogy for capitalism, which is that for most of us, for workers, for kind of small and medium-sized businesses, you have the law of the jungle. You do have a lot of competition. So, you know, the average worker is subjected to kind of immense competitive pressure over the course of their lives. And we're supposed to internalize this. We're really supposed to buy the idea that I am alone, I can only look after my own interests, and I have to kind of push everyone else out the way to get what I want. It's the same with kind of small business owners, like founders, etc. There's this kind of hustling and entrepreneurship that you think is kind of the lifeblood of what a capitalist economy is supposed to be organized according to. And, you know, that has pros and cons, right? It creates this kind of competitive individualistic spirit that devalues care, undermines our sense of community and belonging, creates all sorts of, you know, social and economic problems. But, you know, there is an argument for that kind of system because it also promotes efficiency, you know, leads to allegedly a more efficient distribution of resources. The issue is that the most significant areas of the economy, the areas of the economy where most value is created, where most activity takes place, that's the biggest multinational corporations, the biggest financial institutions and governments, they aren't governed according to those principles. They mostly do not have to compete. They face very little competition, both because they, you know, these large firms have grown up in sectors where they are able to kind of eke out quite a lot of market power, place kind of moats around their business, or they collude with one another. There's some fascinating research on basically collusion between large corporations, particularly in the US. But also over the course of the pandemic, there's this argument that firms basically tacitly colluded to use the inflationary environment to keep prices higher. Everyone thinks prices are rising, so they're more likely to accept a price increase higher than what they actually need to put in place. So that's actually a big reason why we've seen such high levels of inflation. It's basically corporate greed, and they've been able to abuse their market power to do that. It's the same thing with, you know, financial institutions themselves, either colluding with one another or with the state, or working with, I've got a chapter looking at kind of collusion between financial institutions and corporations in which they've invested. And this was something that took place in everything from kind of, you know, the Enron scandal to WeWork. There are these kind of relationships that underpin the way that money is invested that, again, allow basically those in positions of power to avoid competition. And if all of that doesn't work, then these big, powerful corporations can just go knocking on the door of powerful governments and say, I need a bailout. And they generally get it. And even if they don't get it, then the government is going to be there to kind of, you know, smooth over any of the mess that's created, such that most really wealthy, important people in a capitalist economy know that they aren't going to have to face the downside of most of the decisions that they make. Whereas for the average person, you are very intimately acquainted with what the potential downsides of any decision that you are going to make, because you're not protected, but those at the top are.
We're going to go to questions in a few minutes, so if you've got any questions, please hang on to them. I want to get your thoughts on a couple of sort of things that have been in the news recently, and hear you sort of apply all this sort of great theory and these great examples to some of the stories in the news. So one of the stories in the news has been Labour and its relationship. I think these are connected, but relationships with donors and relationships with business. So obviously on the donor side, the sort of so-called freebies which Labour MPs, including Keir Starmer, have been receiving. And then on the business side, I think it was in The Sun last Thursday, this story about businesses having a chance to sort of pay to have lunch with the business secretary. So what do you think a ruling government's relationship should be with donors and with businesses?
I think this is a really interesting trend because there's everything I've been talking about the state, so kind of institutions of state and the relationships that build up over time, regardless of the political party that's in government, between those state institutions and the private sector. But then there are these mediating forces of political parties, right? And what's interesting about the transformation of Labour as a political party is the extent to which it has become characterised by what some political theorists have called cartelization. Now, this was something that was developed in the 1990s to theorize how certain formerly mass political parties had basically kind of, shaken off their bases, their kind of unruly bases, whether that be kind of unions or just members, and sought to develop kind of cartel-like relationships with other political parties mediated by the state. So what that would look like was, a political party set up, and this is not just something that's applied to the UK, by the way. This was a kind of generally European phenomenon. Formerly mass political parties that were often set up by trade unions and had mass memberships derived their power, their influence, and a lot of their resources and cash from that membership or from those trade union organizations. As the trade unions declined and as kind of participation in politics, receded as well. And these are all trends to do with neoliberal individualism, which coincidentally is going to be the subject of my next book. So I'll hold off on talking about that for now. These parties, transformed the way they worked. So rather than getting resources from those mass memberships, they started to develop kind of, very close relationships with state institutions that meant they were able to get more resources when in the state, and also develop these tacit cartel-like relationships that you see emerge between businesses with other political parties. So this is the idea that you can kind of safely hand over power to the other political party on the side of the spectrum without them changing things too much, that it's going to upset the balance of power that both of you rely on to maintain your votes, to maintain your resources, etc. And this is something that we've seen very, it's a fascinating journey for the Labour Party. Firstly, obviously, we saw a reversal of this with a big increase in the membership, close relationships with the unions, and then that being very dramatically reversed under Keir Starmer. There was a real attempt to kind of shrink the party, shrink the membership, centralise control. But also, if you remove that base of power, you have to replace it with something else. Where are you going to get your policy makers, your resources? Where are you going to get the people who are going to go out into the media and defend you if it's not from this kind of base of unionists and campaigners and activists? It has to come from lobbyists, comms organizations, businesses, etc. And that is really what we've seen with Labour. And this cartel-like situation was really aptly summed up by Wes Streeting, who went on TV and basically said, the Tory party needs to sort itself out and then it will be ready to come back into government again. You see this attitude actually actively repeated by people in Labour, and it's almost like they see their role as kind of protecting the status quo until the actual party of government can come back in and making as much money as they possibly can from doing that in the meantime. And the incentives that allow them to do that come from the fact that most of those MPs are really unaccountable. Some of them have been parachuted into seats that they've never been in before. The shrinking of the membership means that there's no one really holding them to account from the grassroots. And this kind of crushing of political and democratic life that's come alongside that through the criminalisation of protest, for example, the conflict that the Labour Party wants to seem to maintain with the unions as well, has meant that those forms of accountability, bottom-up accountability, have also been constrained. It's not surprising that has happened, but what I will say is that it creates space for a kind of expansion of democracy and political life from outside of just the major political parties. And this is what I look at in the third part of the book, is what does democracy look like outside of the voting booth? Because politics and democracy aren't just something that we do once every 4 years. They should be kind of foundational features of our existence. They should be the ways through which we're able to hold those in power to account, and also to, create our own worlds. How are communities coming together to do things like community wealth building, community energy? How are workers coming together to democratize the organizations in which they work and hold the powerful to account? Things like the cooperative movement, for example, are growing, and you're seeing the emergence of this community wealth building agenda, which is essentially how can cooperative enterprises businesses work with local government, local institutions that are fixed in place to create this circular economy that embeds wealth locally and also gives people a sense of power and control over their lives in their local place. What I have obviously to say is that that sense of power and control you get from engaging in kind of extra parliamentary politics is the kind of other side of this equation now, which is the sense I think that a lot of people have that our political elites are increasingly difficult to hold to account. But my argument in this book and actually the next book is that by building power in every area of our lives, building strong communities, building kind of organized workforces where people feel like they have a sense of control, getting people engaged in activism, whether that's in kind of, you know, the environmental movement, the peace movement, whatever, that is a way of building power to hold our politicians to account. And the thing that I was quoted as saying in the Times, which I think lots of Times readers found, you know, very shocking, was that our politicians should be as scared of the people voting for them as the people donating money to them, because we need to be as strong and powerful and organized enough to be able to make our interests known if we want to hold these people who have so much power and control within a fairly undemocratic system to account.
And before we go to questions, is there a sort of particular concrete example you can give as to where this has worked on a local level?
I've got so many examples. The one that I was going to mention earlier with the kind of counterexample to Boeing, and I think this is really neat, this example, and the way that it ties into the Boeing one. Lucas Aerospace was a company that existed in the UK in the 1970s, and it was kind of suffering from rising competition from abroad. The managers were about to lay off the whole workforce, and some of the workers went to the then Minister for Trade and Industry, Tony Benn, and said, will you nationalise us? And he said, we can't do that right now. Economic issues for the country as well. Why don't you go away and come up with a plan as to how you can transform the way that this company works? So the unionists basically consulted all of the workers within this organisation, and the ideas that they came up with were kind of astonishing. They developed collectively a set of proposals, more than 150 proposals, to cease the production of weapons and instead use the resources that were at the firm to produce things like wind turbines, kidney dialysis machine, socially useful technologies that the workers felt would kind of contribute to society, as well as a whole scale transition to a democratically organized and democratically owned company. And this plan kind of became a lightning rod for activists everywhere. It was, you know, the peace movement, environmentalists, those on the left who were much more focused on kind of how we democratize the economy than just simply nationalizing anything. Even the Financial Times was saying this is an amazing thing that these workers have done, because the basic insight that a lot of people have about the divide between workers and bosses is that bosses have the power because they know things, they're capable, they're intelligent, they're capable of organizing everyone, whereas workers are just kind of basically mindless cogs in a machine who are there to just do as they're told. So when workers take this initiative and say, we know what we're doing, we can develop this plan, it kind of cuts through to the heart of capitalist ideology. Naturally, Thatcher came to power and in her war with the unions basically crushed the Lucas plan. One of the authors of the Lucas plan went to work for the GLC, the Greater London Corporation, where he started to work with communities to talk to them about what the technologies that they needed were and how those technologies could be developed by local businesses with the support of local government. Naturally, Thatcher then came for the GLC. Her real enemy was this kind of democratic movement because it cut through this individualistic ideology that neoliberalism was really about, not about free markets, about convincing all of us that we are entirely alone and that we have to compete with each other because no one else is going to look after us. That was the kind of spirit that she was trying to crush. As this plan failed, Lucas Aerospace was kind of chopped up in the shareholder value revolution of the 1980s, sold on to various different companies. And parts of what was once Lucas Aerospace was bought by the firm that supplied the software that went into the Boeing 737 MAX planes that crashed in 2018 and 2019. And I feel like that really shows the paths that have been available to us in the past, which is the concentration of economic political power under the guise of free markets, but actually in service of kind of corporate oligarchy, or worker power, people power, community power, rather than having all that power and control sucked up to the top, you actually have people having the ability to make decisions about their lives and about their workplaces. So that is what I talk about in the end of the book, and it is what I'm going to be looking at also in my next book.
Okay. We're going to open up to questions now. We've got about 10 minutes left. You are also allowed to give a point of view, which is a sort of the tortoise way of doing things, as long as you keep it short. Can we start over there? If we can get a mic. And if you could introduce yourself as well.
Yes, hi, I'm Maria. I work at an Office of Public Affairs for the Baha'i community of the UK. Thank you so much for your talk and your wonderful book. I was just thinking about this false dichotomy and the seeming contradiction between this idea that we should cooperate at a local level, cooperate interpersonally and within our communities, but that actually it's quite an adversarial relationship between communities and institutions, and even institutions between themselves, that we see a party political system is quite a distraction because it distracts away from making true political decisions that make people's lives easier and better, and actually the distraction of a vying of power. And how this zero-sum game of power as a finite resource actually leads to this very dichotomously adversarial and competitive system. But that, like, how do we kind of make sense of this idea that we should also cooperate? But yeah, like, how do you kind of make sense of that contradiction?
I think it's a really good point, and I basically think that we need to invert the system that we have now. So right now we have very nice, neat collaboration at the top. So businesses are very good at working with one another, with financial institutions. Political parties are actually much better at working with one another than we often think, and at kind of handing policy ideas to one another, handing often actual politicians between each other, and handing donors between each other, and also at working very well within state institutions. There's a lot of kind of cooperation that takes place at the top of society. There's an immense amount of basically class solidarity between people who have kind of positions of power and authority. And yet, most people, as I was saying, are subject to this immense competitive pressure within their lives, and that competitive pressure can take the form of, competing with your co-workers. It can take the form, and increasingly does now, of this kind of weird entrepreneurialism of the self that you have, particularly amongst younger generations, of you are creating a personal brand in your social media space and in your life, and your worth as a person can be assessed based on where you sit in this kind of competitive hierarchy. We really internalize that competitive pressure. And even like small businesses, for example, often are subject to much more competitive pressure than those at the top. I think we need to flip it around. Those with the most power should be the most accountable. They should have the most competitive pressure. There should be many more avenues of accountability. It should be very easy to replace them, to ask questions of them, and to kind of force them to account for their actions. Whereas for most people, we should be able to collaborate and have that kind of solidarity that is shown between the people at the top. It should be much easier to be able to do that. And really that is a question, as I've said, of kind of democratizing these systems, of pulling power down, of tipping the scales, basically, so that rather than being more concerned about what a donor is going to think of a particular policy, politicians are concerned about what a community that has come together and organized to make their preferences known about what they think about that policy.
And we've got a couple of questions down here.
Hi.
Hi.
You turn this on or do I? Oh, hi. So, in the last X number of years, in the quest for profit, companies have become busy creating more stuff, more and more and more. Cars that have televisions in them. Things that are so excessive that we have children wearing brands that are meant for wealthy people. So everything has become really out of line, and now we're stuck in a period where everyone's complaining about inflation. I'm from the States, and we're in an election, and no one is addressing inflation, because really what inflation is really about is not the politics, it's really about the climate. Things are burning, things are being washed away, agriculture is drowning. We aren't growing things anymore because we're importing them from everywhere, because our land is under 3 feet of water, let's say. Look what happened just last week, where villages, whole towns in Tennessee, in that area, are gone. the people are still missing. And this isn't just happening in the States, this is a global issue that no one wants to talk about because they don't have an answer for it. So really what inflation is about is capitalism creating a system where we have in every community, instead of a grocery store and a drugstore and a whatever, we have giant stores selling more and more stuff. So what do we do about that?
It's a great question, and you're quite right, because yes, inflation is to a significant extent about the constraints that are imposed on the supply of goods and resources and commodities in a world of climate breakdown. So in a world of floods, of wildfires, of a difficult world where it's hard to grow food sustainably. That is a big factor. Another factor is corporate greed. As I mentioned, companies basically hiking prices much more than their costs and using the inflationary environment effectively to collude to do that. And all of these things are problems of basically corporate power. If you look at, I have the case study of ExxonMobil in the book. ExxonMobil knew about climate breakdown in the 1970s. It had its scientists researching the issue, found evidence for the greenhouse effect, slashed funding for its climate research team, put all that funding into organizations that were spreading doubt on the reality of climate breakdown. Also put a lot of money behind the campaign for a carbon tax on the basis that a kind of tax on average people would seem unpopular and make the green agenda less popular. And at the same time, it was really working on building these very, very strong relationships with the American state and with American political parties. So, obviously Rex Tillerson, former Exxon CEO, became Secretary of State under Donald Trump. An undercover Greenpeace reporter recorded a conversation. He went undercover as a lobbyist with Joe Manchin, the Democratic senator, basically lobbying him to oppose any regulation on the climate, and doing so successfully. So the links between these massive oil companies and the state are deep and profound, and this is why you see this kind of schizophrenic approach to climate policy in the US, because Joe Biden comes in saying, I want to do something about climate breakdown because it's popular and that's what people want. When he gets into power, he becomes imbricated in all of these networks where you cannot do something about climate breakdown because there are extremely well organized groups that have spent decades making sure that they are embedded enough within in state institutions to stop you from doing that. That is a massive problem of corporate power. And then when we think about our energy bills rising, the big oil companies, whilst saying energy prices have gone up, oil prices have gone up, it's a supply issue, that's why prices are rising, that's why your bills are higher, making the most significant profits that they've made in decades sometimes. Shell, BP, Exxon, they all made mega profits. This is why we had the windfall tax on big energy companies. So fracking, yeah, another issue characterized by massive monopoly power. And again, the problem with renewable energies is basically that you cannot make the sun and the wind scarce. It is not a profitable avenue for big companies to invest in because you cannot create scarcity. So, if we want to have a renewable economy, then we have to confront this problem of corporate power.
We've got 1 minute left. I want to end on a hopeful note. If you read the book, the third of the book is full of solutions and great examples. So I think there is a lot of hope here. If someone read your book and read all these big ideas, and you're going to have to answer this in 30 seconds because we're out of time, but if someone read this book and wanted to go and do something about it, they wanted to, put the book down, walk out of the door and do something about it, what would you... If you were going to sort of give yourself that authority to tell them what to do about it, what would you tell them to do about it?
I like the question that it's framed in terms of hope, because the reason that it may sound not hopeful is because the way that we're used to thinking about how to fix things is to say, we'll elect a government and the government will do X. And the more remote the possibility that seems, the more hopeless we feel, because we basically live in a world in which we expect other people to take responsibility for these problems, in which we basically expect other people are going to come and save us and deal with these problems themselves. And actually, the only way through is when we learn to build power together. So that can mean getting involved in community organizing. It can be everything from a campaign to save your local library through to getting involved in a local co-op, supporting your local food bank, anything that is going to embed you within a community organization that allows you to feel you have agency and feeding into these kind of decisions that are being made about politics. It can be joining a union and getting involved in union organizing at work. It can be joining a protest, anything that allows you to understand and feel and make real your relationships with other people as citizens, as workers, as human beings, because it is only through that collective power that we will ever be able to make those at the top as scared of us as they are of the wealthy.
Thank you, that is hopeful. I won't make you do another round of applause, but feel free to. Thank you so much, Grace. Grace will be over here signing some books. Please do read the book, it's fantastic. There's so much to it, which is sort of demonstrated by how easily we got through the time. And yeah, thanks all of you for coming, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.